You know how in sitcoms they play a laugh track every 2 seconds, even when the joke is terrible? The laugh track plants the idea that the joke is funny, and your brain responds like it actually is. Well, idle games are like a laugh track, but for video games. I'm Jake Frondorf, and this is The Psychology of Idle Games. If someone were to ask you to define a game, your answer would probably include a player doing things, and I doubt anyone would have argued against you a decade ago. But today, there are lots of games where you don't have to do anything. They're called idle games, incremental games, or clickers. For those who aren't familiar, they're very simple games. Most of them follow this formula. The longer you wait, and the more you click, the more currency you get. Then you spend that currency on upgrades that let you get currency faster. But whether you're there playing or not, the game progresses forward, letting you continue to accumulate currency. And if you've never played these games before, they're somehow really compelling. Idle games somehow have the very highest player retention rates of any genre. Online game publisher Kongregate said their idle games have 4 to 10 times higher retention than the next top games on their platform. But how on earth is a game where you don't do anything compelling? Is there some sort of flaw in human psychology that makes us so susceptible to something so stupid? See, idle games actually just started as a joke. Back in 2007, one of the most popular games of the time was RuneScape. And in that game, it was more common to see players grinding levels for nearly useless skills than anything else. Just outside of every city, you'd see huge lines of campfires that players would make in order to raise their fire-making skill, or cutting down trees, or cooking fish, or whatever else. In fact, RuneScape had so much grinding that automating RuneScape was a popular pastime. Progress quests started out as a parody of these MMORPGs. The joke was that most MMOs were so repetitive that you might as well remove the awkward middle stage between clicking and seeing a number go up. The game just wanted to show how meaningless and redundant it was to play MMORPGs, and it illustrated that perfectly by, well, cutting out everything but clicking. Progress Quest's satirical angle was one that resonated with these games' players, and people picked up the game because it was funny. After making your character, the game, which was basically a glorified spreadsheet, would play itself. However, the developer, Eric Fredrickson, was surprised when people actually enjoyed the game. Many of the idle games that followed were also supposed to be parodies. Cow Clicker was a commentary on play-by-appointment social media games, like Farmville. Every 6 hours, the game would permit you to click a cow. Just one click. Cookie Clicker is a commentary on capitalism. You click a cookie, you receive a cookie. Eventually you hire some grandmas to help out. But before long, you're running cookie factories, cookie farms, you have hundreds of cookie mines, you're sending ships out to space to find other cookie planets, even warping space-time with reality by condensing antimatter into cookies. And that's the tip of the iceberg. Capitalism consumes everything. And so do cookies. But if these games are all jokes, games with the game part stripped out, why are they actually so compelling? It's a pretty difficult question to answer. See, the way psychology studies engagement doesn't take idling dynamics into account. The process model of engagement says when a player stops taking game actions, it means they're not engaged with the game, and most psychology studies take that for granted. But idle games often force you to disengage. It's a required mechanic, so how do you account for that? It's also particularly hard to study an idle game since so much of the dynamics of the game is when a player chooses to play and when not to. In no other genre is choosing when to play or not a real gameplay decision. But idle games are played in semi-frequent short bursts, while psychology studies are typically done in single long sessions. So not only do we not have an adequate model for studying these games, we don't really have an adequate methodology either. But that doesn't mean there haven't been attempts to answer this question. In particular, there are studies that rely on survey data, and while it's not perfect, it gives us the start of an answer. So, what did these surveys find? Why would anyone waste their time with these games? Well, for starters, they're very rewarding. Since idle games are always progressing, every time you open it, you're greeted with a load of money to spend. The longer you go without playing, the more rewarded you are, and the more tempting it is to open the game back up. Secondly, the games do a lot to make players feel powerful. For example, after you prestige, your tiny numbers become big numbers much faster than before, and that gives players a sense of accomplishment, even if it was largely unearned or inevitable. Ultimately, your brain doesn't care how you get these rewards. You'll still feel a sense of accomplishment regardless. Players feel the same sense of reward as they'd get from grinding an RPG. The game has absolutely no stakes as well. You can't lose. You're always making progress forward. The only difference your input makes is the speed at which you progress. Idle games don't impose schedules on you. They never threaten to take your progress away. However, that doesn't paint the actual picture. In fact, enjoyment isn't even among the top reasons why people play these games. The biggest reason is because they're incredibly compulsive. See, unlike other games, you're never allowed to stop playing. You're playing continually from the moment you install the app to the moment you delete it. In the scientific literature, it's referred to as intrusive omnipresence. And because of that, players feel a continual sense of unease when the game idles. Your current rate of currency accumulation is always lower than it could be if you were more active. And gamers hate playing a game poorly. But surely players would just quit once they realize there's nothing to it, right? Not quite. It's hard to justify quitting for 3 reasons. Firstly, the endowed value effect plays a big role. You ascribe value to your current game because of how much progress you've made in it so far. The longer you've played, the more value you ascribe to it. Basically, people become emotionally attached to things they've dedicated time and attention to. Secondly, they're hard to quit because of their dynamic nature. As you progress, the nature of the game changes, new mechanics and upgrades are constantly unlocked. The players are continually presented with new goals. Finally, it's incredibly easy to justify continuing to play it. It takes so little to let the game keep idling. Players who get bored or frustrated with a game tell themselves they'll check the game less often, or they'll justify their compulsion to keep playing because of how little time each session of gameplay takes. But you're still playing it unless you delete the app entirely. Now, you can't have a conversation about why people are playing these games without talking about who plays these games. I said earlier that idle games seems like a perfect casual genre, but very few casual gamers actually play them, according to demographics data from Congregate. A majority of idle game players are actually pretty hardcore gamers. And even though it's surprising, I think that fits the ideas I've presented so far. See, hardcore gamers spend tons of their time grinding through games. Their brains are already wired to love progress, upgrades, and bigger numbers. And their brain doesn't separate the difference between inevitable progress and earned progress. It's all the same. The other big reason hardcore gamers game is to build up competence. They like being skilled at the games they're playing. But when it comes to idle games, every second you're not playing, you're playing poorly. You're leaving cookies in the cookie jar, so to speak. If you want to have the most optimized idle game setup, you must play the game a lot. The sense of unease that hardcore gamers feel is probably a lot greater than people who aren't as competitive. All of this paints a picture pretty similar to MMORPGs. Like idle games, MMORPG players feel like they're missing out the longer they don't play. Their peers continue to play and pull ahead, while they stagnate. And that can make them very addictive. There's a lot of literature about online games causing addiction, and one of the big factors is the sense of unease they get when they're not playing, just like in idle games. Of course, take this with a grain of salt. There haven't been any addiction studies on idle games yet, so ultimately it's purely speculation on my part. But it's not baseless. The literature has studied its compulsive nature, just not how that relates to the possibilities of addiction. Of course, idle games require players to take breaks while their currency builds up, while asking for only a little time in return, so perhaps it's not a big concern. But at the end of the day, humans enjoy silly things, like small numbers becoming big numbers. If you're one of the people who like playing idle games, don't be ashamed. It's just how we're wired. But if it causes you more anxiety than joy, ask yourself what that big number actually means to you. Thanks for watching, and if you like seeing small numbers become big numbers, try clicking the subscribe button. If you think about it, it's like a massively multiplayer clicker, but everyone only gets to click once. And once you subscribe, we both win. Thanks for watching.